I want to talk about preferences. Now, preferences can be kind of technical and can introduce topics that will come up later in the tutorial, but I think it's important to talk about preferences now because changes that you make to preferences will improve your workflow. So let's do that. We'll start off by talking about general preferences, then I'll cover audio preferences in another tutorial and all the rest of the preferences plus keyboard shortcuts in a third tutorial. In a fourth tutorial, we'll talk about what happens if things go wrong when you set preferences and how you can start all over again. So to find preferences in Windows, you go to Edit, Preferences. On Mac, you go to Adobe Audition Preferences. So click on Edit, go down to Preferences. And the flyout menu gives all these options. And which one do you choose? Well, it doesn't make any difference which one you choose because they all open up the same dialog box with those submenus appearing down the side. We're going to focus only on General. We'll deal with these other guys later. In general, we talk about certain things in terms of the appearance and how things work inside Audition. We'll start out with this thing called zoom factor, which we won't change, but zoom factor allows you to zoom in or zoom out of particular views. So I'm going to go to a view, let's say for this view. If I click on these buttons down here to zoom in, it zooms in by a factor of 33% and zooms out by the same factor. That's the zoom factor is, and we'll keep the default because that works just fine. Moving on from there, we'll go to the Allow Context-Sensitive Channel Editing. And notice that when I hover over any one of these guys, a little tooltip appears telling you what this thing is all about. And that's helpful because the help file for Audition doesn't necessarily put all these guys in one place. So it's good to know that you can always just hover over them and see a tooltip. Well, context-sensitive channel editing, let me show you the default way, and I'll recommend that you change it. I'll go to a stereo file, which is how this thing works. In the stereo file, let's say I want to just select just the left channel, this upper line here, the bottom is the right channel. If I want to select it, I would drag across it, but I'm selecting both the left and right channel, which is not what I want to do. I can overcome that by clicking on this little R button down here to turn off the right channel, and then now I can select just the right or just the left channel. But I'd rather have that be done automatically by where I position my cursor. So I'll do that by changing the preferences. You go back here to General, and click on this context-sensitive channel editing. I'll click OK. And now when I hover my cursor over the bottom of the right channel, notice a little R appears below the I-beam. That means if I click now, it'll select just the right channel. If I start sliding up, it'll select both channels. Begin with the top. If I go toward the top, you'll see a little L appear there, meaning you're going to select the left channel now. And if I start going down, it'll get both. So that little context-sensitive thing is important for selecting particular channels inside a multi-channel file. Let's go back to Preferences once more. Down here it says Show HUD for selection ranges only. HUD is a heads-up display, this little volume control device here. I want it to be visible all the time. This little selection would mean that it won't be visible until you make a selection, otherwise it won't be there. I'd rather it be showing up all the time, so I'm not going to check that box. This next one is Synchronize Selection, Zoom Level, and Play it across files in the Waveform Editor. I like that one. I'm going to select that one and show you what that's all about. If you have a file open inside the Waveform Editor here, let's say I zoom in on it a little bit, and I'll explain how to zoom in and make selections in other tutorials. But let's say I zoom in on it, got my current time indicator right here, and I've made this little selection. Now, this file is a file from a studio session, and every single file in the studio session is the same length, and if there's a problem in one place in a file, it's probably the problem in all the files in the same place. And it's good to know that I can go from one file to the next and have all this stuff already set up. So here I've got it set up for this file. I might make a fix here. Then I can go to another file, and that exact same setup will be there. The zoom setting, the current time indicator location, and the selection. So that's a good thing to have, and that's why I like checking that particular preference. Moving on down the line, default fade curve type. Right now it's linear and logarithmic as opposed to cosine. I prefer cosine. Let me show you what that means. When you have a file and you zoom out all the way so you can see the entire file, you have two little faders in the corner here. If I drag a fader, it's going to be a linear fade. If I drag it up or down, it makes it into a logarithmic fade. In this particular case, it would fade up slowly, and then as it finishes, it would suddenly finish the fade up. If I go over here, the same thing applies. I drag it in, it's linear. If I drag up and down, I can make it logarithmic. Linear is not really any good at all. It's too abrupt. And logarithmic's not bad, but I prefer what's called an S curve, and a cosine fade in or fade out. And I can get that by holding down a keyboard modifier. In this particular case, the Control key in Windows and the Command key in Mac. And notice that it turns into this little S curve. The cosine fade in, fade out is a much more comfortable fade, and I prefer it to be the default fade in, fade out. So I'm going to change that. I'll undo this work here by pressing Control Z or Command Z on a Mac. Go back to the preferences, go back to general. I'm going to change this to cosine. What this means now is that the default fade will be a cosine fade. See how it's a little S curve. If I want to switch back to logarithmic and linear, I hold down the keyboard modifier Control and Windows Command on Mac, and that comes back again. So it's just a small thing, but I like the fact that the cosine is the default edit. I'll undo that. Go back to the general preferences again. Down here, this editor panel context clicking. The context menu is a menu that's in every single panel. You right click to open up a context menu, and the menu is contextual for the particular panel you're in. If I right click here, it'll be a different menu here, different menu here. Those are called context menus. They're wonderfully helpful. They're great things to have, and you're comfortably able to find them by right clicking. But you can change the default click inside just the editor pane here, the editor panel, to a control right click instead of just a right click. And I prefer not doing that. The reason I do that is if you make a selection here and then you control right click, you can extend the selection. That's the default way. And some people would rather just right click to extend the selection, but I'm going to let that be the control click to extend the selection. Let's go back then to preferences again. So we'll keep that in its default setting. And spectral circular brush clicking, we'll keep that in the default setting as well. How that works in the spectral frequency display, which is something we will look at frequently. It's a great tool for editing and getting rid of noises and things. You can use a paintbrush, believe it or not, a paintbrush to select areas of sound in different frequencies and apply effects just to the brushed areas. The default behavior with this little paintbrush is to click and just move the current time indicator. If you want to paint, you got to click, hold, and then you can start painting. And that's a really good thing because the other behavior, the change behavior, is not so comfortable as this. Let me show you the change behavior and why I think it's not a good idea to use. If you instead choose create a circular selection on mouse down, that means every time you click, you start immediately painting, and that can be a little disconcerting. I'd rather just have it move the current time indicator and then start painting. So let me undo that. Go back to the default. And finally, this reset all warning dialogues. Sometimes when you do something, you'll get a little dialogue that says, oh, if you do this, the following thing is going to happen. If you don't want to see this dialogue again, click this little box. Well, if you click that little box, you won't see the dialogue again. But if you reset all the warning dialogues, then you will see them again. So that's how you set the general preferences here inside Adobe Audition.